It is episode 20 of the Breakdowns and Breakaways podcast. I'm Eddie Provident. As I said, Danny Shirey. I don't know if this is going to be a good episode or more of a pessimistic episode. I think maybe a little bit of both, because you've got a rant prepared, I've got a rant prepared, we've got a trade to talk about. Penguins did win the last time we saw them play as of this recording Saturday morning. But let's talk about what you wanted to start with. Mike Sullivan. I saw on Twitter you had some very intellectual conversations with a few people on Twitter or X or Elon's catastrophe, whatever we're calling it these days. Just, you don't think Mike Sullivan should be the coach of this team anymore. Is that correct?
That is correct. So I believe it was Wednesday morning I published a column on the Substack that said, I didn't say Mike Sullivan needs to be fired right this second, although I wouldn't have a problem with it, but I made the case that he should not be back as Penguins head coach next season.
Okay. Why is that?
Where should I start, I think, is the better question. You and I have talked about probably everything I'm going to go through here at some point or another in previous podcasts. The biggest thing I want to get out of the way right now, before I get into it, though, is that is not me blaming Mike Sullivan for the fact that the Penguins have not won a postseason series since 2018. That is not me blaming Mike Sullivan for the fact that the Penguins missed the playoffs last year, or the fact that they look like they're on the fast track to missing it again this season. Okay? Is that fair?
But Danny, if you're not blaming him, why should he be fired?
Well, here's the thing. I think it goes far beyond, like, I get that it's just what sports fans want to do. They want to, find a scapegoat. They want to.
Absolutely.
That's we saw it with Matt Canada and the Steelers, and
that was more than a scapegoat. Don't get me started.
Look,
don't get me started.
I'm not saying Matt Canada was.
It's not
a good
football
offensive
season.
coordinator.
Don't get me started.
Right, that's fine. Whatever. But no, in the column that I wrote, I made the case that, look, the fact that the Penguins have not had any success for so long, it's on the roster construction, and that's Ron Hextall and Kyle Dubas. It's on the players, and yes, some of that is Sidney Crosby, Jake Gensel, Evgeni Malkin, Chris Letang. The postseason series that the Islanders swept the Penguins, I think Crosby had 1 point and assist in Game 4, and that was it.
Can I push back on something you said, and it will tie into it will tie into Mike Sullivan. You said Kyle Dubas' roster construction. He was pretty handcuffed when he came in.
To an extent.
I would say more than to an extent. And I think he did the best he could with what he had. I don't think I was not particularly excited about the Ryan Graves signing. I know you weren't either, but I don't think anyone thought Ryan Graves would be this bad.
No, he's having like the worst season of his career.
That you can't blame that on Kyle Dubas. So maybe there is a little bit more blame to be put on Mike Sullivan with what he's getting out of these players.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you just said is not pushing back on what I was about to get to.
Okay, so I won't interrupt you.
So while yes, you could go back to the Islanders series that they got swept and Crosby had 1 point in Game 4 and that was it. You could make the argument that Ron Hextall was terrible, and I would say so. But if you look, the 2022 postseason, when they lost to the Rangers, that team was pretty good.
Yeah.
If you look at, Hextall's value signings, if you will, he had Danton Heinen playing on a $1.1 million cap hit that season. He had Evan Rodriguez playing on $1 million cap hit that season.
You're not allowed to give Ron Hextall credit.
No, I mean, I'm going to call it how it is, man.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. There were some good things that he did, absolutely.
Absolutely. I liked the Raquel trade at the time. The Carter trade was fine at the time. The extension was god-awful.
Yeah. I think people forget to separate those two. The trade itself, okay.
Well, I think sports fans like to blanket everything.
Yes,
so
that's what we do.
All that being said, how does Mike Sullivan not shoulder any of the responsibility for that, especially after so many seasons? Okay, it'd be different if, And I went to bat for him too for the lack of playoff success. You could say that they lost in not the year that they got swept by the Islanders, but the next time they played them in the postseason after the COVID season. Yeah. So that would be 2021.
Yeah.
Tristan Jarry was horrendous in that series.
He was terrible. And then the year with the Rangers was
Louis Domingue.
Louis Domingue, third string goalie. Yeah.
Right. So you could make the argument there. I don't know how many times I'm going to say you could make the argument. I'm going to try to not do that anymore. But my point being is that regardless of those items, at some point, Mike Sullivan has to shoulder some of the responsibility for that. And hang on. So I'm going to tie this back to what you said.
Okay.
As far as Dubas having his hands tied, the other thing I cannot help but feel, if we go back to July 1, Dubas had not been at the helm all that long after being hired, right, by the Penguins. So obviously he had not had a bunch of time to build out his front office and the rest of his team that was going to help him build this roster. So who was involved probably in a very large capacity with that? Mike Sullivan. And then you start to look at how they went about building this roster. The Erik Karlsson trade was great. They shed a lot of dead weight, bad contracts, and brought in the Norris Trophy winner. That's outstanding. But I think in hindsight, and I alluded to it at the time too, but they had a lot riding on Karlsson making up for an utter lack of offensive anything going on. And when you look at the Nola Chari signing, you look at the Lars Eller signing, you look at how Sullivan has deployed and utilized his bottom six players over the past several seasons, it's hard not to feel like he had a relatively large hand in that as well. So again, that's not putting the blame squarely on him, but he's in his 9th season as Penguins head coach, and outside of his first 2 seasons here, he has not won jack.
Yeah,
and there are how many teams have burned through, and I'm not saying, that you just got to burn through head coaches until you get to your guy or whatever.
I think there's a balance there. Yeah, there's some kind of middle ground where at what point in time do you say, okay, enough's enough?
There is a balance there. And even if you're just going back to like since 2018, so not even including the year that they won a round and then the Capitals eliminated them. But since the Capitals eliminated them in the second round of 2018, you know what the Penguins' record is in the postseason?
Probably not good.
6-15.
Yeah, that's not good.
What coach survives that, man?
It's a thing with Pittsburgh.
Well, that was what I wrote in my column. I was like, I had obviously talked through a lot of this, but I got to the point, I was like, the only other professional sports team that I could think of that would tolerate this lack of success to such a degree is the local football team.
So are you a believer in the old hockey trope that he's lost the room or his message has gotten stale, or do you just think that it's more of a scheme thing and more of a fit thing at this point where he's not deploying these players correctly? Or maybe a little bit of both.
So again, obviously when you have Jansen Harkins and, I know Colin White's gone now, but you got Colin White and you got a bunch of guys that Dubas claimed off waivers to try and help out the depth here. I get that those pieces aren't great and it's not an optimal situation for any head coach. I would make the argument that even right now, Sullivan is not getting the most out of the group that he had because a lot of people are like, oh, everyone expected this team to like be a fringe, blah, blah, blah. Well, they're like at the low end of being a fringe team right now.
Barely a fringe.
And the idea that no one else out there could do a better job than Sullivan has, I just don't buy it because really all the evidence you need is that the Penguins have won multiple Stanley Cups after an in-season coaching change, but go back and look at what Boston did with Bruce Cassidy. He had a little bit of playoff success, but didn't ultimately take them all the way. They moved on from him, and then he went to Vegas and won a Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the Bruins brought in Jim Montgomery and had one of the greatest regular seasons in NHL history. Trophy. So it doesn't have to be an indictment of either side, but sometimes
just time to move on.
It's been 9 seasons.
Yeah. So before we pivot then, what in your mind is it actually grounded in reality to think that they will move on from Mike Sullivan?
No.
Because of the contract he has,
Well,
the tenure, and just how Kyle Dubas has been speaking about him.
No. I would be shocked, despite what I've wrote and everything I've just said, I would be shocked if Sullivan's leash doesn't extend at least until the halfway point of next season, at least. I don't know, man. It's tough. I think it's interesting because I genuinely do believe that Sullivan is a good coach, despite what I've said about him. But I think that Dubas coming in and not necessarily being exposed to Sullivan over the past however many years, he comes in and sees the way that Sullivan operates and the way that he thinks about the game. And I tend to align myself with a lot of at least what Sullivan says in the media about just generally the game of hockey and how he wants it to be played. I tend to align with a lot of those things. So Dubas showing up and going, oh yeah, like I agree with that. But I think because he's so new, and Dubas even has said himself that he's been hesitant to kind of rock the boat, if you will, in that capacity because he hasn't been here all that long and he's still trying to learn the dynamics and the inner workings of the franchise. So I think when he shows up and hears and sees all these great things from Sullivan, it's even tougher to move on from him. And then you've got the contract extension for Sullivan that hasn't kicked in yet. Now, I will say, everyone who's concerned about, oh, you're going to have to pay him, all those people also say that Sullivan would get hired instantly, which means that the Penguins are off the hook for that extension.
Okay. So,
I don't know. It's tough. I genuinely do like Sullivan as a coach, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if he were to leave and go to the Maple Leafs or the Devils and take them over the hump. That would not surprise me at all. But the Penguins have gone through multiple GMs under him. They've changed a ton of personnel over the past several seasons. The only lever that they have left to put, and it would be different if Dubas had shown up and decided that they weren't going to try to keep competing for a Stanley Cup. But he showed up and said that their goal is to try and bring another Stanley Cup to the Penguins while Sidney Crosby is still playing. So if that's the case, what other lever do you have to pull other than trying to see what they look like under a different head coach?
All right, like I said, we'll pivot here. I think we've beaten the Mike Sullivan horse as much as we can. And I honestly, like, at the end of the day, it's fun to talk about, but is anything actually going to change? That's what it comes down to.
Well,
so
yeah, and I got a lot of people responding to me going, oh, like, this is stupid. They're not going to, it's okay. Just because they're not going to do anything, or that we think they're not going to do anything, does not mean that this is not a worthy discussion to be had.
Correct. But I want to talk about Evgeni Malkin. So this is what sparked this for me, because I texted you this week and said I've got a Evgeni Malkin rant. I was on, unfortunately, Facebook, and Bob Pompiani had reposted the picture of Yager, Lemieux, Crosby, and Malkin.
What a great picture!
Oh my God! And he said, the Mount Rushmore of Penguins hockey. And there were people in the comments saying, "Wow, no, get Malkin out and put Fleury in, or get Malkin out and put someone else in, or like Paul Coffey."
That's what happens when you wade into Facebook comments.
And I'm like,
Paul Coffey.
Yeah, there was a Paul Coffey comment in there. There was a Ron Francis comment in there, which I could kind of out of all of the arguments, would probably be him and Fleury would be the only two that I would even remotely entertain. But it's Malkin. It's Malkin.
Yeah,
it's Evgeni Malkin. And here's my thing. Even this season, I think he's getting unjust hate.
Yes.
You have talked about this in the past. I have kind of talked about it a little bit. I have seen Jay Fresh post about it. I've seen a couple other Twitter accounts talk about it. It's not his fault that his line mates can't finish. And I am not saying that Evgeni Malkin is perfect. I'm not saying that he is, doing everything right. But I don't think that just because his numbers on the surface, the assists and the goals, don't flesh out what he's doing, it doesn't mean that he's not providing chances and creating opportunities and driving.
We've been seeing the same thing with Erik Karlsson.
Correct.
Everybody wants to, and again, I'm not saying point production does not matter. It absolutely does.
But it's not the end-all, be-all,
so
and
much
it's not
deeper
the
than
only
that.
part of the story.
And it's funny that a lot of the people that want to cite raw point production are the ones that are like, oh, XG doesn't have the whole story.
But here's the thing. Let's remove this season from Evgeni Malkin's career right now.
I don't even think we need to, but go ahead.
Okay? I want to talk about Evgeni Malkin, the player as a whole, and the legacy that he's left in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
Did you know, I don't know if I sent you this, there are 5 players in NHL history, okay, that have won the Art Ross, the Hart, the Conn Smythe, the Calder, and the Ted Lindsay Award at some point in time in their career. There are 5 players that have done that. Can you name them?
No, but I'm assuming Malkin would be one of them.
Wayne Gretzky, Mario Lemieux, Bobby Orr. I'm sorry, not Mario. I take Mario back. He didn't win the Calder. Wayne Gretzky, Bobby Orr, Patrick Kane, Alex Ovechkin, and Evgeni Malkin. Those are the 5.
It's pretty good company.
That's incredible company. For people to say that this dude doesn't belong on the Mount Rushmore of Penguins hockey, what is with the hate with this guy? This has been his entire career. Like, he was a dominant force in 2009 and in 2012. I don't think
2009 was one of the greatest postseason performances we've seen in the modern era.
He was at 2009 where he put up 113 points as well. That might have been 12. It was either 9 or 12. But still, he beat out whatever year it was. He beat out Ovechkin by 3 points for the Art Ross Trophy. This dude has done everything that you can do in a hockey career,
and he's done it all with the Penguins.
All with the Penguins. Despite the lack of point production this season, he's still a point per game player.
And he's always done it playing second fiddle to Crosby and getting the leftover scraps.
And then when Crosby doesn't, when he's hurt, and Crosby's been hurt a lot in his career, this dude rises to the top, puts the team on his back, and does what he needs to do. I don't understand what it is about Evgeni Malkin that people love to hate him. Is it the Russian thing? Is it the fact that he's not Sidney Crosby?
Yeah,
is it
that definitely plays
I don't understand. Like, this dude consistently does not get the love that he deserves. Not even just from fans. The NHL left him out of the top 100.
Oh, no.
At what point in time do we look at this dude's career and say he is probably a top 30 or 40 player?
Easily.
At what point in time do we stop hating on this guy? Like, at what point in time as a fan base do we embrace the fact that this will be controversial, but Gino at his absolute peak in his prime was more dominant than Sid.
Yes.
Just because of how physically gifted he was, how big he was, how nasty he could be. He brought a different element to the game. And I am not taking anything away from Sid, because Sid was the consistent, day in, day out, absolute top 5 player of all time, probably top 4 player of all time. But Gino at his absolute peak when it happened was better than anybody in the NHL. And I don't understand why we can't just accept him and give him the flowers that he deserves. I don't want to see another situation where it takes 15 years, for something to happen with him after his career, because this fan base doesn't acknowledge what we've had with him. And I'm tired of seeing the Gino hate. Like, it's every year, man.
Yeah, you asked when it's going to stop. It's not going to happen anytime soon, because in a second I'll actually get into the season that he's having. But he's in his late 30s. Like, he is on a downward trajectory right now, and he's not going to have some like late career bump where he's going to become like a top 15, 20 player in the league again, especially if he's playing with Drew O'Connor, Riley Smith, Matthew Phillips,
Valtteri Puustinen, and
but I don't think that what you're getting at, I don't think that appreciation will come back, because it was there, maybe not across the entire fan base or across the entire league when he was in his prime. But I think right now we're seeing, even within the Penguins fan base, like taking it way too far, and I don't think that appreciation will come back until he's gone. Just quickly, though, I do want to touch on the season that he's having. So obviously he's well below a point per game at this point. And I'm not even going to say his general offensive impact, like just on not his point production or anything like that, but how he's influencing the Penguins' ability to create quality chances at even strength. It has taken a little bit of a dip from even where it was last year. He was still very, very good last year. That being said, he's still in that capacity. He's still in the top quarter of the league. And it's been funny to me seeing a lot of people talk about how Gino needs to change his game and be more engaged defensively and be so much stiffer and tougher to play against. Malkin is having one of the best defensive impact seasons of his entire career right now. And if you compare his defensive impact this season, which is right around league average, depending on what model you want to look at, slightly below or slightly above, if you compare that to where he was last season, which was replacement level, that is a big boost to his overall value. And I'd say that he made that change because he knew he had to. So I don't buy that Malkin needs to, like, he knows and he has done that. I was arguing at the beginning of the season that Malkin was much more engaged and effective in the defensive zone than Crosby was. Has that persisted over the entire season? No, it's definitely been wishy-washy, and a lot of the knocks you see on Malkin's defensive game, they have shown up at points in time throughout the year. But generally speaking, if we're looking at this in a holistic manner, I think he's been fine in that capacity, and we wouldn't be having
Put it this way. If you brought up the Toronto Maple Leafs earlier for a landing spot for Mike Sullivan. If you were the Toronto Maple Leafs with the top 6 that they have, right? And they have that core 4, core 5 there. If you include Morgan Riley, I know he's a defenseman, but they have that 4 or 5. Would you not go after Evgeni Malkin to fill out that top 6 if he was available on the trade market? Put him with that kind of skill on the top 6. I'm just like, there are teams that would love to have Evgeni Malkin right now.
Contract notwithstanding, most teams in the NHL would like to have Malkin.
To have Evgeni Malkin right now. And our fan base cannot appreciate prime Malkin, let alone Malkin right now. And it was just like, again, Facebook comments, and like you said, you never get into the Facebook comments, but I even saw some of it on Twitter, and it was just like, at some point in time, guys, like, we've got to acknowledge that this dude is an all-time great. Like, he's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. There is no doubt about where his standing is in the game of hockey. And it's frustrating to see the lack of appreciation that this player gets. Speaking of line mates and, who he's playing with and, random dudes that are coming in, I keep botching his name. So the Penguins made a trade for
Emil Bemstrom.
I keep in my mind, it's always going to be Barnstrom. The first time I read it, I saw the M as an RN, and it's just never going to change in my brain now. So Emil Bemstrom, tell me a little bit about him. I know that this dude has a wicked shot. I think that Jeff Merrick was the one who said on 32 Thoughts yesterday that he could dent the goalpost with his shot. Like that's the kind of power we're talking about. But he only has 5 goals coming in. So tell me a little bit about what he could bring, and was this worth it? Is this a good bet? Obviously, Alex Nylander and a draft pick went 6th round pick.
Yeah, so
conditional. See, if he scores 6 goals, it'll be a 3rd.
Right.
So talk a little. Is that worth it for this kid? Give me a little bit of a story on Bemstrom.
So I'm a little more familiar with Bemstrom just because he's coming from
Columbus.
the Blue Jackets, and obviously I'm from Columbus, so I still keep up with the Blue Jackets more closely than I do a lot of other NHL teams aside from the Penguins. What you said about Bemstrom is accurate. He has a very hard shot. Like, there's no denying that.
If I could steal an old school hockey term, he's got a heavy shot.
He's got a heavy shot. That much is true. It hasn't translated to a ton of actual goal scoring at the NHL level. If you look at his AHL numbers, this dude lights up the score sheet frequently. So I don't know. It's kind of the same thing with Matthew Phillips, who also has a history of lighting up the AHL. I don't know that the Penguins have the personnel to pull that, I guess, untapped talent or skill out of him, if you will. But I have no problem at all asserting that Bemstrom is better than some of the guys we've seen in the Penguins' bottom six this season, and that includes some guys who are still on the roster right now. Go ahead.
So you bring up the bottom six, but is this a guy that is going to be able to produce in a bottom six, or is he more built to be a top six scoring
No,
forward?
I actually think Bemstrom is unlike a Nylander, for instance. I actually think Bemstrom is the kind of guy, like, I think he's more built for a bottom six game in the NHL. As far as the actual and a little bit more on Bemstrom. So, like I said, he has struggled to produce at the NHL level. Typically, he puts up solid defensive impacts, not like Zach Aston Reese kind of stuff, but toward the top of the league in that regard. And he hasn't, and the Blue Jackets, especially last season, have been a very poor offensive team in terms of being able to get to the high danger areas and create quality chances. And he hasn't had a great impact in that regard, but it has been okay, which is at least encouraging. Again, I don't know that, having Lars Eller as center right before we sat down, he was at practice skating on a line with Eller and Riley Smith. I don't know that Eller as his center, Eller who has very minimal passing capability at this stage of his career, is going to be the guy to all of a sudden pull some goal scoring ability out of Bemstrom. I don't know that will happen. But Bemstrom he's solid defensively. I don't think he's going to be an absolute anchor when it comes to just creating chances or influencing the team's ability to do so. Anyway, as far as the actual trade goes, I actually really like it for the Penguins. Nylander, past 2 seasons, he's played 14 games up in the NHL with the Penguins.
Yeah, it was just an experiment that didn't work here.
Yeah, he had a goal and an assist, and that's it. And even though there were points in time where I was like, yeah, his off-puck play has really improved, and it was obvious that it was not going to work out here. And even if you look at his AHL numbers this year, his raw production rate on a per-game basis has dipped below where it was last year, and that's certainly not encouraging because guys like Phillips and Bemstrom were outscoring him in the AHL.
Yeah.
As far as the condition on the pick goes, I know a lot of people are concerned that, if Bemstrom scores 6 goals the rest of the season, all of a sudden that 6th rounder turns into a 3rd rounder, and that 3rd rounder, like, oh my God, they're going to need that because they're going to stink at that point in time. 2 things. One, I'd be shocked, for the reasons I just mentioned, shocked if Bemstrom scores 6 goals over the last, how many games do they have left? 27?
27, yeah.
26 games. I'd be shocked. Even if he scores 5 goals within the next 3 weeks, they're going to bench him. They're not going to roster him.
Now, let me ask you this.
Well, that was a slip up. They'll roster him, but I'd be shocked if he gets to 5 goals and then they don't put him up in the press box.
Okay. Let's play devil's advocate here.
Okay.
Say Bemstrom does score 6 goals. Wouldn't that mean that maybe the Penguins are turning things around and fighting for a playoff spot?
Yeah, I mean, they might be.
I mean, it would be. It's not, obviously, that wouldn't be the only indicator, but I can't see a world where he scores 6 goals and the Penguins suck.
No, that's fair.
If he's going to score 6 goals, the rest of the roster's probably clicking. And if the rest of the roster's probably clicking, that means they're probably moving in a better direction. Now, is it too little too late? That's another discussion. Right. But
even if that's the case, so let's say he does get to 5 goals and they're in the race and he's playing well and they're like, we can't bench this dude, okay? And he gets to 6 goals and that turns into a 3rd round pick. You know what? Bemstrom right now is probably better than what that third round pick would ever end up being. And the
Yeah.
other thing to consider is that I believe he's 24 years old, so he's a restricted.
let him
He'll
be
be a
the third round
restricted
pick.
free agent at the end of this season.
Let him be the third round pick then.
Yeah.
Like I think you and I agree about draft picks. They're, unless you have a top 10, top 15 pick, I'm not really concerned about.
Oh, but Jake Gensel was a third round pick. Is that the norm?
No.
If that, like, it's just so funny to me. If everyone knew that third round pick Jake Gensel would become the player that he became, he would have been a top 10 pick.
Exactly. So I'm not like, especially, you've brought this up in the past with the window that they have right now. It's this year and maybe next year. Maybe. So
maybe next year being if the offseason
goes the right way,
is navigated correctly,
right,
based off Dubas's first offseason at the helm. There's not a whole lot of reason to believe that'll be the case.
Like, I don't give a shit about a third round pick.
No.
If Bemstrom can come in here and produce and help this team, I mean, here's the thing. I know they have 3 or 4 teams in between them, but they have 7 points to make up on the Lightning with 4 games in hand. It's not undoable. Like, it's not like impossible for them to make that up if they go on a heater. And maybe I'm being an eternal optimist here, but at some point in time, you have to think the power play is going to find level.
I'm past that point. Lars Eller's still on the top unit, so I'm past the point of thinking that this power play is going to figure it out. And Lars Eller being on the top power play unit, going back to what I said earlier about Sullivan not being in the greatest situation as far as his roster construction is concerned, but I'd also argue that he's not getting the most out of it. And
all I'm saying about
I didn't even bring up the overtime debacle, which I'm not going to, but
please,
if you know, you know.
My point, before you get me all hot and bothered here, there is enough talent on that power play. Granted, it has not clicked at all this season, except for maybe like a 3-game stretch. I wouldn't be shocked if at the end of the season, those types of players, the Sids, the Carlsons, the Genos, say, F it, we're taking things into our own hands, and they strap the team on the back, and they somehow find their way into the dance.
Well, they might be in this situation because they have, quote unquote, taken things into their own hands.
So that's my point. If Bemstrom helps with that, if he scores 6 goals and is a part of that, take the third round pick, toss it out the window. I don't care. I want to see playoff hockey. You want to see playoff hockey. And the only hope that we have of seeing playoff hockey is if guys like Emil Bemstrom figure things out and go on a heater to help the top 4 or 5 guys. That's what that's going to be. They need scoring from other places other than Sidney Crosby.
Yeah.
It can't be Sidney Crosby all day, every day. And that's what this season largely has been. It's been the Sidney Crosby show, co-starring Jake Gensel.
Yeah, and at least of late, they have been getting production throughout the lineup a little bit. That's encouraging, but based off the entire rest of the season, and if you start to look at individually some of these guys' careers, there's not a whole lot of reason to believe that that'll sustain itself. But again, I'm with you. Like, if for whatever reason they are in the thick of things and Bemstrom's at 5 goals and they need him in the lineup because he's playing that well, go ahead. Go ahead.
To wrap things up, and I hate quoting this guy.
Uh-oh.
But I just rewatched the 50th anniversary documentary.
Okay.
And to quote Mark Madden, this is a team of stories. This is a franchise of stories. Wouldn't it be one hell of a Pittsburgh Penguins story for this team to go on an absolute heater and make a run in the playoffs?
It would be.
That's all I'm saying. I'm leaving it at that.
All right.
This has been the Breakdowns and Breakaways podcast. For Danny Shirey, I'm Eddie Provident. Don't forget to hit like. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to hit all the notification stuff. Leave us a 5-star review. Or if you don't like us, leave us a 1-star. I don't care. But leave us a review. Tell us what you think. Drop a comment in the YouTube channel. Go to Danny's Substack. Make sure you do all that fun stuff. He's coming out with some good material, as always. But for the two of us, this has been the podcast. We will see you next week.